there, and welcome back to Raconteurs with Russell Gammon. As you know, we've spent the last year doing a series on Africa's history, and it's always been an ambition of mine to write a book on Africa's history, and that is largely the exercise that I've been working on. And I've been casting around for a new direction for the podcast coming into a new year, and what it is that I really want to share with you guys and hopefully a wider audience is issues pertaining to conservation and ecotourism and travel and that sort of thing. So we're going to be in the new year rebranding the podcast to World Wildlife Journeys. And the format's going to change as well, because you'll notice that you can actually see me now instead of just hearing me. And you'll probably notice that there's another fellow on the screen. And I'll be introducing Grant to you shortly. Some of you may know him, having traveled with him in the past. But I hope that you guys will enjoy this particular edition. We're going to be talking about elephant conservation in Botswana, a place where Grant lives, and he's something of an authority on the subject. So we're going to be picking his brain and talking about an incident that happened last year where there was quite a large die-off of elephants in a particular area of Botswana that you may perhaps have missed, since there was, an epidemic going on in the human population as well. But certainly in conservation circles, this raised some serious concerns, and some research has been done on it, and we're gonna get Grant's take on it and get him to walk us through what happened at the time. So I hope that you guys enjoy the new format. Please feel free to send us your comments. I'm always interested to get your feedback. It is our ambition to at once eventually make this a live event for patrons, and that'll give you guys the opportunity to actually participate and put questions to Grant and I at the end of the discussion. So we just need to solve some technical challenges to make that happen, and we'll let you know as soon as that's going to be happening, and then hopefully that you can join us for these conversations. So before I introduce Grant, I just want to set the stage for our discussion today about elephant conservation. The last 100 years have obviously seen a tremendous decline in wildlife all over the world. And unfortunately, Africa has been no exception to that. If you rewind the tape to the 1930s, they estimate the elephant population on the African continent was around about 10 million animals. And today that figure stands at around about 450,000. So we've lost a tremendous number of these large herbivores. But the perspective or the backdrop against which this has happened cannot be ignored, that in the same time frame, the human population of the African continent has gone from about 128 million to now close to 1 billion individuals. So the story really is about loss of habitat. And this is something that you're going to hear me harping on about, because it's kind of I think it's a very, very important facet of what is happening conservation-wise all over the world. There's little point in preserving any particular species if we do not have somewhere for them to live. And so habitat preservation is at the center of conservation all over the world, and a subject close to my heart. But to introduce Grant to you, he is a colleague of mine of some 25 years that I've known him. He's also a professional guide like me, and he lives in Kasane in Botswana. He studied for a Bachelor of Science at the University of Pietermaritzburg, and he is a lecturer for Smithsonian on their world trips and trips around Africa. So good morning, Grant, and welcome to the show. Thanks for agreeing to be my first guinea pig.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Russell. It's good to get together and have this discussion out in the open with a whole big audience, I hope.
Yeah, I just got a message from, as you know, we're farm sitting for a German couple at the moment. And I said to her, the staff came to me this morning and commented that they hadn't been paid. And she said, I'll do it later because it's 6 o'clock in the morning here and it's -6. So I'm not getting out of bed to go to my computer just yet. So I thought, okay, I'm quite glad I'm in the Southern Hemisphere at the moment.
Hell yes, hell yes.
So,
Yeah.
guys, Grant is his own company. Along the lines of what we do with World Wildlife Journeys, he also does small group safaris. Whereas we are concentrating on a wildlife experience that is worldwide, as our name suggests, and promoting conservation through travel. Grant's company is similar, but he has a very specific focus in that he's particularly focusing on endangered African species. Is that right, Grant? That's kind of your...
Yeah, that's right. We set each of our safaris centered around an iconic animal that is, in trouble. Um, and yeah, it alludes to our company name, which a lot of people laugh about. But well, I'll let you carry on with
Oh no,
what you have to say.
yeah.
So
Listen,
yeah,
I
our
think
company
its
name
name...
is Last Chance to See, and the name comes from that very well written book, Last Chance to See, which was written by Doug Adams and Mark Carwadine, and it was basically about seeing some of the animals that are disappearing on the planet for the last time. And so Last Chance Safaris is modeled on that. We try and get people to come and see these particular animals that are not the sole purpose of the safari, but the safari is centered around that particular animal, be it gorillas or wild dogs or elephants or any number of different animals. And in so doing, try and create awareness about numerous conservation issues, and at the end of the day, end up with some conservation disciples leaving the safari after they've been with you.
That's fantastic. What a great vision. I love that. So let's talk about elephant conservation in Botswana. This is a conversation that you and I have had, on and off over the years, because it's, something that we're both interested in. Just to set the stage for our listeners who may not be aware of this, but Botswana has kind of become the last bastion of the African elephant. I think Botswana is now home to a significant portion of those animals that are left on the Earth's surface. Grant will be able to give us the exact percentage. What is Botswana hosting these days?
So we're at about a third of the entire population of Africa is in Botswana, and if you take the entire Khaza region, which is these elephants still are free to roam between us and Zambia, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and even Angola. And so if you take that entire region, that whole area, we're probably sitting at about a half of the population of elephant. This single mega population is about half of what Africa has remaining. And Botswana alone, we're at about 135,000 elephant. That's the official figure. There is some contention around that figure, but it's like any census, there'll always be contention about a census, depending on which scientist reads the data and analyzes the data. But it seems to be sitting and has been sitting in and around 135,000 for the last decade or so. So it's it is Botswana does, as a country, singularly hold the largest number of elephants in Africa.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that African elephants are basically one of the only wildlife species that can be accurately counted, because you can see them from the air. And so that's the way they do these censuses. They fly a transect, and then they look out the window of the plane and they're looking at a specific stretch of bush and counting the animals that are in that particular stretch. And then they extrapolate. And I think that's where the controversy comes in, is not the number of animals that are counted, but how do you work out what that strip represents of the total population. So, but it is a fairly, it's something that's been going a number of years, and I think they've got pretty good at doing it now. So you can pretty much take that number at face value. So talk us through what happened last year. It was in around about March, if my memory serves me correctly, and it was in a specific region of Botswana, and I'm particularly interested in drilling down into exactly where it happened. And there was suddenly a number of carcasses that were found. Now, for those of you that don't know this, we usually get a die-off in the elephant population, but that usually happens at the end of the dry season, which is kind of October, November. And there we will see a number of animals that will collapse and die at the waterhole. They're usually sort of subadult animals, so they're not tall enough to reach high enough to feed themselves because they've eaten everything at ground level. And they're also not able to keep up with the herd that is cycling, sometimes 40 miles a day from water to grazing and back to permanent water sources. The thing that alarmed everybody about this die-off was there were a couple of things that were different about it. One was that it happened just at the end of the rains. March is usually an area where there's plenty of food for the animals and plenty of water for them. And the other thing that was concerning was these animals did not appear to be dying of what we call poverty, starvation, but that they were actually dying, some of them relatively suddenly. So tell us a little bit about kind of how the discovery was made and what the concerns were at the time, Grant.
So the discovery was made by an NGO out here in Botswana. They were flying through the area and they discovered a whole batch of carcasses in one specific area. Now, if any of you go and have a look at a map of Botswana, and you can see the Okavango Delta sitting there in the northwest corner of our country, the delta itself looks like a hand placed down on the Earth's surface. And on the northern side, you've got the little pinky finger, and down towards Maun, you've got the thumb with all the fingers in between, leading up to the wrist, which is the main part of the Okavango River before it splits into all these various rivers and channels. And at the junction of the palm and the little finger and the wrist, there's a place called Soronga. And in that little area of the Okavango is where this die-off was first discovered. Soronga has a number of villages there, local villages. They are generally pastoralists and some subsistence farming going on there. But it's also wilderness areas. So some of those areas are private concessions that are linked ultimately to the national parks and game reserves of Botswana, in part of this enormous wilderness that is northern Botswana. But it was unusual that these carcasses were found in a relatively small area in and around this village of Soronga, which is, call it a village, but I don't know what the population of Soronga is, but there's quite a few people there, and quite a lot of cattle and quite a lot of goats and other pastoralist settlements and what we call cattle posts in this part of the world. So this is what raised the alarm. I think the first count was 169 carcasses, some of them very recent, and many of them appeared to quite literally have dropped in their tracks. So the onset of death was acute and sudden, and to use technical terms, they died in sternal recumbency. In other words, they fell on their chest, quite literally face planted where they were walking and died as such, which is always an indication of acute death.
Mm.
So originally it was thought that perhaps it was because it was so localized, and because this has happened in other places in Africa, most notably in Zimbabwe, they thought at first it was a premeditated poisoning event to kill elephants for their ivory. However, that didn't pan out because it was elephants of all ages, which would happen in any poisoning event anyway, all ages and fitness, and but all their tusks were still intact. None of the carcasses had been mutilated at all. So
and
that
I think the other kind of indicator of this, because we've seen these events in Wangi where there's poisoning at waterholes, and the thing is that the poison of choice is usually arsenic, and that kills everything. So it's vultures, it's jackals, it's literally every single thing that even comes and feeds on the carcass will then die. And I understand that that was one of the things that really kind of ruled out any kind of man-made poisoning event. Is that right?
yes, absolutely. And the funny thing is that also when there's a poisoning event, like it's not just animals that feed on the carcasses, it's other animals that would drink at a poisoned waterhole.
Correct.
So they would also pick it up. So there was a whole mystery around this.
Yeah.
And the world pretty much got really agitated about it. There were a few NGOs that I felt, and this is a personal opinion, I felt that they got a little hot under the collar, and they started pointing at past decisions by the Botswana government and trying to lay the blame of this particular incident on the Botswana government. And they started to raise the alarm internationally, globally, and everybody got on this bandwagon that there was something nefarious afoot, which was not the case. Now, Botswana government has a long history of playing their cards close to their chest.
Yeah.
They tend to not be very forthcoming with information. I think in part because they've been stung by the press, and so they have a general policy that until we know the answer, we're keeping mum. And of course, that the world doesn't like that. The world likes to be fed tidbits of information constantly so that they can draw their own conclusions. They don't want to actually wait until the data is in or the information is in. And if 2020 taught us anything, it was that this has become as large a pandemic as the coronavirus. This trying to make assumptions and decisions on minuscule amounts of information that lead you to believe things that are wholly untrue. But be that as it may, this was one of those things. And so globally, there was an outpouring of concern from NGOs, from conservation organizations, from numerous organizations that are, I wouldn't call them armchair conservationists. They do good work, but quite often they are, I'm trying to be polite here, they can be a little militant.
Let me help you out here. I think because the reality is that you and I had a conversation about this last year, and I was saying, what about this and what about that? And what was interesting to me is as a person who's interested in science, but who's not a scientist, hasn't been trained in scientific method as you have, was, you were kind of chiding me and saying, this is not actually a simple thing to solve. This is it's not a straightforward exercise. And, whereas conservation and the running of conservation organizations used to be the purview exclusively of, people who were scientists, that has changed in this day and age. And today there's, people who are, come from different backgrounds, from social science backgrounds, from kind of humanities backgrounds, who, you know, have this concern about wildlife and what we're doing to the planet, and they've got involved, and some of them have become very, very influential. But they do not have the benefit of the scientific background that you have. And you know, the discussion that we had reminded me of a conversation I had with a guy who was a coroner in New York, and we were talking about the poison abrin, which, you know, you will know is a plant-based poison in Africa. And I sort of said to this guy, you know, if something like this were used to poison somebody, would you, as the coroner, be able to figure out what it was? And he said, absolutely not, because unless we knew what we were looking for, you know, we could do a spectral analysis of the chemical compounds in the body, but unless we actually knew what we were looking for, there are millions of them, and we wouldn't know which one to start looking for. And I recall that as we were talking about these elephants and saying, well, yeah, you know, when you're looking for a natural, you know, firstly, if you're looking for a natural cause, you're going to be looking in the carcass of a dead animal. So where do you even start looking? And plus you know, the sample that you've got is not in a morgue refrigerator. It's, you know, it's in 40-degree heat, and that poses a whole raft of challenges. So, you know, as to your point of the armchair conservationists sitting in an air-conditioned office in Switzerland, you know, it's a little more challenging when you're there on the ground for the veterinarians who are working on this to actually come up with a definitive answer. Um, so it was a huge challenge that the government faced.
Absolutely. And, you know, to try and get people to understand the size of the challenge, one of the greatest or one of the largest voices that came out for these conservationists, gentleman from Wales, and he was making assumptions from Wales during the pandemic. You know, he was on lockdown, and I was getting quite irritated because he was making all of these assumptions based on snippets of information that he was getting, and he didn't have the whole picture. And he's an influential individual, and you know, he had influential media outlets banging his drum, and it got the world pretty hyped up. But essentially what happened ultimately is that the government, in this case, not always, in its wisdom, it held back with the information until it had enough information to tell the rest of the world. And I can give you an insight into how they got that insight. And as you say, the whole idea of going to look at these carcasses had a host of logistical and physical challenges to deal with. The heat was just one of them. Now you've got to get a team into some of these elephants died in remote, heavily vegetated areas with no roads. So they get in by a helicopter. They have now got to do a necropsy in the field on a 5-ton animal. Okay. It is horrible. It is messy. It is smelly. And then you have to have some sort of baseline data of what to look for. And they picked out a few things, like there was evidence in the liver that there was something wrong, but those samples didn't, tests on those samples didn't yield anything. There was a whole lot of samples that they sent all over the world, not just to local laboratories, but to laboratories in Zimbabwe, which have developed some really, really good techniques in looking at poisoning, as well as Europe, Canada, the USA. These samples went all over the globe during a pandemic when flights were hard to come by, courier services, refrigeration. So, you know, and all the time, the conservationists are saying, we want information, but it was a slow process and it required patience. The first thing they actually realized that there was something more complicated about this was there were some elephants that didn't die straight away. They showed neurological symptoms, grogginess, walking in circles, uncoordinated mobility, and so on. And so they decided to actually take samples of these living animals, and they darted them with a drug you've probably know, M99, which is a common drug for tranquilizing large mammals. And they darted these elephants with M99, took their samples, and then they administered a drug called M50, which reverses the M99. And M50 is basically Narcan. Everybody in the world has heard about Narcan, and it's basically Narcan. The elephants came around from the M99, and they appeared to no longer have any symptoms. So all of the symptoms they had before they were knocked down had dissipated. This confused them a lot, and they followed some of those elephants for 24 hours, and they were essentially cured. And this now started to lead them into a line of inquiry that there is something that was affecting the neurological synapses, and now they could narrow their search into what they were looking for. And anyway, cut a long story short, they narrowed it down to a neurotoxin that is found in cyanobacteria, often called blue-green algae, but it's not an algae at all. It is a photosynthetic bacterium, and in certain times, particularly after a drought, this bacteria will bloom. A lot of people living on coastal areas, I know it happens in places like the west coast of Africa, west coast of the United States. You get these red tides, and these red tides are the same poisonous cyanobacteria blooms. This can happen in fresh water as well, and this is exactly what had happened. Now, there are very specific things that need to happen for this blue-green algae bloom to happen. And one is that it has to be a high concentration of phosphates in the water for it to happen. How does that come about? Well, in areas where you have quite a lot of cattle utilizing water holes, all the while until they pretty much dry up, they will leave their manure in large quantities around the edges of those water holes. Now, when you get your rain coming in, it fills up those water holes and it washes all of that dung and high phosphate content into the central part of the water hole. Because one of the other questions was, why is it that only elephants are dying from this? There was one donkey that was found dead that they suspected might have been the same, but it was only suspected, was never proven. Why is it only the elephants that are dying? Well, it's because the cyanobacteria concentrated in the middle of the pan of these water holes. And elephants, once they've drunk the nice fresh water on the edges where all the other animals will drink, will then wade into the middle of the pan, and they go and mud bathe and they splash and cavort, and in that way they will ingest these toxins and get infected. And in some cases it was pretty much instantaneous. Some of them died extremely close to the water hole, within sight of the water holes, and in other cases it must have been dose related. Some of them died a long way from the water holes, and in other cases, some of them never died. They just showed symptoms of drunkenness and ultimately survived. So that is what led them to the cyanobacteria bloom. Ultimate decision of what was the cause.
So that was the hypothesis. It's very interesting, and I guess it begs the question in the face of climate change that we should expect to see more incidents like this. I mean, the scientific data does seem to indicate that these kind of algal blooms are increasing in size and frequency around the world with the increase in global temperature. And an interesting statistic is that the southern part of Africa where we live, the average temperatures are rising at twice the rate that they are in the rest of the world. So we are going to be very hard hit by this if it is a product of global climate change. That's for sure.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And you know, it's climate change, but it's also how we respect our various freshwater systems, and even saltwater systems. We are pumping phosphates and all sorts of other chemicals into these systems that promotes these blooms as well. So it's a feedback loop. You've got the warmer temperatures, warmer ocean temperatures, plus this increase in fertilization. Effectively, you're fertilizing these algal blooms. Um, so yeah, it's certainly something that we need to consider. You know, right at the beginning of this whole uh, worry that everybody came with, they said, you know, these elephants are dying. If we need to put it into context. In total, I think they GPSed and marked off 323 carcasses in total. Many of the media reports said it was over 400. Some people said it's 700, but the data shows us that they GPS 320. I think it's 323. I might have that number wrong, but it's certainly not far off. They GPS located 320 odd carcasses. And if you take a population of at least 135,000, 323 deaths is a really, really, really tiny proportion. Not to say that it's, you know, it's something that we shouldn't worry about, but now that we know what it is, we can look out for it more frequently. We do, as you mentioned earlier on in our conversation in the podcast, we have these natural die-offs every year that nobody really gets worried about. We have had, up until last year, we'd had a 3-year drought, which again concentrated more of these dung piles around water holes that never really got to their full size with each rain season. And we ended up at the end of this drought season having this one die-off. But the previous 3 years, we had massive die-offs. You and I were on a safari where we were witnessing literally elephants dying in front of us
Yeah.
at the end of one of those drought seasons. And it was hundreds. So you've got both the malnourishment that occurs, and then certainly in my neck of the woods, because of the particular environment that we have here with these floodplains, the elephants come down at the end of the dry season and they are literally scratching in the dirt to eat the roots of the floodplain grass. And at that time, they're picking up anthrax spores. And anthrax is a naturally occurring bacterium that is found across Africa, but there are certain pockets of it, and Joby is one of them. And the elephants contract anthrax every year. And we have quite large anthrax die-offs annually, but nobody really, you know, worries about that. So, you know, it's I see these, and even the cyanobacteria one was really a natural die-off, ultimately.
Yeah.
Not pleasant, but ultimately it was a natural die-off. So, yes, the world got worried, but be assured there's really nothing to be worried about, because those 323 elephants have already been replaced with the
Yeah.
amount of babies that we've seen come out in this current wet season, which is quite phenomenal. In fact, we won't have another die-off like this, because right now, northern Botswana is one big soggy mess, and everything is getting flushed out. All the cyanobacteria is getting washed away. Everything is being flushed out. So we won't have one of these outbreaks again until another drought period, followed by a good wet season.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is it's wonderful how nature has a way of renewing itself. I mean, I think you and I share this view that, you know, one of the things that uh, that I just find so exquisite about nature is how that recycling of nutrients and things goes on within the environment, and how everything is cyclical. You know, it's only us humans that make linear systems, or try to
Yeah.
make linear systems.
And if there's one thing that the world lockdown has shown us this year, is the ability of nature to bounce back. And it does. If you just give it a half a breath, it bounces back. It's got tremendous resilience.
Yeah.
And in an area like northern Botswana, which is mostly wilderness, and we'll get into this a little bit more, I'm sure, when we talk about the other issues of conservation, but it is mostly wilderness. And now that we're having these exceptional rains, we're going to see a tremendous bounce back. And that's just how the cycle goes.
I want to just shift gears a little bit. You and I over the years have gone back and forth about the role of sport hunting in conservation. It's obviously a controversial topic. And Botswana has just recently been through an interesting evolution where it banned elephant hunting under the previous president, and the new president that's come in has challenged that and has mooted the possibility of lifting the hunting ban. And can you just update us on where that whole process is at the moment? And your kind of thoughts about it. I'm particularly interested, my hypothesis has always been that the hunting operators created they were a force for good in conservation, insofar as they created a presence in an area, they pumped water, they did anti-poaching patrols, and they steward the wildlife in their areas. And that's really, when people talk about, hunting being good for conservation, they're talking about stewardship, and they're talking about, making wildlife areas financially viable. But leaving aside the financially viable bit, because the Botswana government is in the unique position that it can afford, maybe more so than other African countries, to do conservation for the sake of conservation, being a relatively wealthy country. But I'm particularly interested in the absence of the hunters doing anti-poaching work, and in particular pumping water. What has happened to those areas that the hunters have pulled out of? To the wildlife that was there, and what do you see? What's your take on what would you like to see happening in the future of Botswana?
This is such a multifaceted question. It really is. And we could take any one of those facets and do just a singular podcast on that one facet. So let's try and précis some of them. Okay. All right. So, and we have had this back and forth when we have differing views, which is good, and I welcome debate. On a personal level, and this is Grant Nell personal level. I'm not a fan of hunting. I'm not a fan of killing things for fun. I find that to be something sociopathic about that. Having said that, I also really understand that there's an industry around this, and yes, good stewardship has happened in the past. With wilderness areas that otherwise would have had no stewardship whatsoever. And having a presence there reduces illegal hunting, poaching. It brings in income for rural communities that really have no other form of income, and they have to deal with wildlife on a day-to-day basis in a way that a lot of us, the Western mentality, can't get to grips with. Maybe the cattle farmers from Montana can, because they understand what wolves do to their calves. Whereas, the rest of us that love to come to Africa, we don't really get it. But when your maize crop gets ruined, it's just ready for picking, and your maize crop gets trashed in one night by 3 elephants.
I
Do
always
you love
say,
elephants?
I always say
No,
to
not the
Americans,
elephant.
us Africans, we don't understand why you hate raccoons. We think they're cool. And Americans go, raccoons, they're terrible. They do that. And it's like, yeah, wildlife is great in the abstract. If it's not knocking over your trash can, it's a great So it's wildlife. As soon as it starts, as soon as it starts bugging you, it's like a nuisance, right? So yes,
And
it.
now it starts taking away your livelihood. So bugging is one thing. Making you destitute is
Yeah,
another thing. I
yeah,
start to hate that animal. You hate it with a passion, and then if nobody else is taking care of them, you take care of them yourself. Um,
correct.
so this was the tightrope that the Botswana government has walked for a number of years.
Yeah,
The previous president, Ian Khama, he's very anti-hunting, and he brought his personal um, crusade to policy, and he stopped hunting and didn't take into consideration the fact that there's livelihoods at stake here. Um, the new president has seen it on the other side of the political divide, and he has promoted hunting sometimes in a way which I'm not a particular fan of. But it garnered him a lot of votes, and particularly amongst the rural communities, and they were very happy to see it come back. So, as I say, it's multifaceted.
so
Generally, these areas are well stewarded.
as it stands at the moment, hunting is scheduled to reopen. Is that correct?
Yes, hunting was scheduled to reopen last year, but obviously it was shut by a pandemic. Um, so there are still elephants on quota and other wildlife. Everyone concentrates on the elephants, but they forget that there's a whole lot of other animals that are also on quota. Each one of them is, there to be taken. So my real problem on the hunting side, and the stewardship, I'm with it. The industry, I'm right there with it. I get it, and I feel for these communities. I want people to live with wildlife, or as somebody once said to me, live as part of wildlife, not apart from wildlife. And the only way to do that is to find a happy medium.
Hmm.
Now, the issue with hunting in Africa, so I won't just concentrate on Botswana. The hunting in Africa is that it has, unfortunately, become a massive money spinner. And because of that, it has opened itself up to all sorts of corruption and abuse of the system, and the stewardship does not seem to be there anymore. It's fueled by one word, and that's greed. Um, there are, of course, a lot of professional hunters that remain professional, and they insist on being good stewards. But it's very, very hard when hundreds of thousands of dollars, and those are the numbers that are being waved under people's noses, to break the rules and ethics of hunting that have governed a sport that goes back a very long, long time. And it's interesting to note that Frederick Courtney Selous himself, a well-known hunter, and he took Teddy Roosevelt around Africa. He called for a halt on hunting in the latter part of his career, saying that we need to be better custodians and monitor this better. So,
Well, it's always, and you and I know this because we know these guys. But it's always interesting to sit around a campfire with a retired professional hunter, because
yes,
there's always a melancholy there of what they have been party to. I don't know if that's been your experience, but so
absolutely.
often when you sit down with those guys who, those real old timers, and there's a melancholy because they kind of are have to confront the fact that they've been part of the change that they lament, that they've seen Africa change, but they've been party to that change, and they've been part of that change. Look, I think you and I are on the same page where the kind of where the ethics of hunting is concerned. It's not something, trophy hunting is not something that I really can relate to. That atavistic need to nail a trophy to the wall. And I think there's very few people that can relate to that. If you can, that's your thing. But I think a lot of people can't. Where I'm concerned is the desire to ban hunting for moralistic reasons before we've actually come up with an alternative plan to actually, you know if you as it was put to me by somebody once, everybody knows what they want to be free from. Not everybody knows what they want to be free for. So
Mm.
it's easy to say we don't want this, but it is incumbent upon us, given the demise of the wildlife in Africa and how precious the space that they inhabit is, because we can tie ourselves up in knots to preserve a particular species. If we don't preserve the habitat that they live in, we are absolutely wasting our time, because these animals have to have a place to live. And when we, you know, probably the prime example for me would be the banning of hunting in Kenya in the 1950s and 60s. If you look at the side by side comparison of Tanzania and Kenya, Kenya banned hunting, Tanzania did not. Tanzania, 30% of the wildlife area, of 30% of the land mass is set aside for wildlife. In Kenya, it's 10%. Now, if you ask those old time Kenyan hunters, what happened to the rest of this wildlife territory in Kenya that was there, they say, oh, well, that was all the hunting blocks and it's all been given over to cattle. So, in particular, that was my concern when President Kama said that he's going to ban hunting. The alarm bells went off in my head. Is what's going to happen to the wildlife that's living in those areas? Who's going to take care of them? And who's going to be taking care of the pumping of the water and all of that sort of thing. And there were a lot of very prominent figures who were very loudly applauding the president's decision, and they had been very vocal about the fact that photographic tourism would step in and swoop and pick up all of those leases and double the number of safari camps in Botswana. But I don't think that any of that actually came to pass. And this was well pre-pandemic time. They had ample opportunity to take up those leases, and I don't think a single one of them was taken up. Or am I incorrect?
No, there were a number that were taken up, but they were all what I would call the prime photographic areas. So there were areas in the Okavango Delta that lent themselves to photographic safari. So with multiple activities, you can go boating, makoro, fishing, night drives, game drives, walking, and there's wildlife. Now, when you get into other areas of Botswana, away from the Okavango Delta or the Linyanti or the Savuti or any of these areas where water can be found year round, then what happens is you end up with these homogeneous blocks of land, usually heavily wooded, without these great savannas and floodplains where animals congregate. And nobody wants to go there for a photographic safari. And so no photographic company wants to take on these leases for these blocks of wilderness that are very important blocks of wilderness. Don't get me wrong. They act as sponges for wildlife during good rains, taking them away from other environments and letting those environments rest. They're extremely important blocks of land. But no photographic company wants to set up a camp in a stunted Mopani forest. It's just aesthetically unpleasing, and it also doesn't have the diversity of wildlife.
Yeah.
So many of the photographic guys were vociferous about the hunting ban, saying, "Yay, what a wonderful thing! What a wonderful thing!" Those big companies, the big money companies, only stepped up to get hold of the leases that were in what I call the prime game viewing areas.
But
The other areas. remain untouched.
Yeah, and to be clear, those prime areas that they snapped up already had photographic camps in them.
Yes, they did. They were
You
split
see,
use.
this has been my argument all along, is that it is a natural progression of, you know, supply and demand. You know, the tourism around the world is growing at a tremendous rate. Or should I say it was prior to this year. Yeah,
I know. I've also cancelled last year. It didn't occur. I just went 1921 and left that year behind.
1921. I like that. I'm going to use that. All right. So, you know, global tourism prior to 2020 was one of the fastest growing industries around the world. Africa's current share of international tourism is 2%. 2%. We're at almost quarter of the Earth's surface, and we get 2% of world tourism. So, the scope for growth is phenomenal. And as we've seen, you know, the Okavango I've always held has been the prime example of this. That as there's more and more demand for photographic safari areas, the balance will tip. As lucrative as hunting is, photographic safaris beats it hands down if the area lends itself and if the demand is there. And that's really the big if. So the point is that for people who for whom hunting is an anathema, then the answer is, well, you know, invest in photographic safari tourism, invest in increasing the demand for camps, and camps will eventually be built in those areas. Maybe not all of them, but the alternative, I think, is to say, okay, if we're going to get rid of hunting in this particular country or that particular national park, then there needs to be an alternative source of funding that is found. And that is happening increasingly, you know, with things like the Peace Parks Foundation and Africa Parks Foundation, where donor money is actually being put up to look after these areas, and that's a wonderful initiative. I support it wholeheartedly. And if you're going to say, well, we're going to get rid of hunting in this particular area, but you know, peace parks are standing by with a line of credit to step into the breach, and they've got community outreach programs teed up and ready to go, that's great. I would support that wholeheartedly. I'm just not in favor of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because as you alluded to in the beginning, this is a much more complicated issue than I think most people realize.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we've seen with the cessation of hunting, and you mentioned it earlier, that what happens to all the water holes and so on. What has happened to those water holes that those stewards, those professional hunters, kept pumped and full of water during the dry season, which has its own whole host of conservation issues which could be explored in another podcast, water holes.
Absolutely.
But you know, they kept those water holes going, and they kept elephants away from certain habitats, and instead of increasing pressure on those habitats during the dry season, those water holes have all but pretty much stopped being pumped. Pumps have broken down, or the hunting outfitting companies have pulled their equipment out. You know, they're not going to spend money running it if they're not making money. And we are now seeing elephants moving into the Kalahari, deep Kalahari. They're going to cattle posts and breaking guys' boreholes for water. There's a water line that runs between the little town of Nata and Maun, and it runs right between the Makgadikgadi National Park and Naipan National Park. And the elephants are now digging up this massive pipeline and creating these pools of water on the side of the road. So a drive to Maun right now on this major arterial road is pretty good game viewing because these elephants are ripping up infrastructure to get to water. And this is a factor only because the water holes that they were used to using are no longer there.
Yeah.
They are ripping up campsite infrastructure to get to water. This never happened during the hunting times because there were water holes pumped on their journey from one place to another, there were these water stops along the way that they could learn to rely on.
Yeah.
That no longer happens. They don't have it. Now it's a marathon to get from one habitat that they are feeding into another habitat that they know they can get food at. It's a marathon, and in between they need water,
Yeah.
and that water has dried up. So they're now finding other ways to get that water. And if there's one thing we know about elephants, they are very determined when it comes to obtaining water. They don't give up easily.
They're actually incredible. I'm gonna tell you a story. I don't know if I shared this with you, but when I was working at a camp in Wangi, the elephants like to drink clean water. They're kind of connoisseurs of water. They're very fussy about what water that they drink. And so, if you build if you're going to pump water into a pan, they will fight over the end of the pipe, and pull it out of each other's grasp, and they'll eventually end up digging it up all the way back to the water pump, which is very expensive exercise. So if you're going to pump water into the pan, as you know, you've got to build a trough, and you pump the water into the trough and it overflows into the pan. So there's no pipe for them to fight over. The pipe that's there is embedded in a huge chunk of concrete, and even that doesn't last that long. But I had this exercise where we built a trough and we started to pump water into that trough, and it was the first night that we'd started pumping water into the trough, and there'd been a massive rainstorm. So there was water running everywhere, and the whole of the bush was flooded with water. And one young bull elephant came out, and he came down to the water hole on the far side from where we'd built the trough. And he started drinking there, and he had 2 or 3 mouthfuls, and he stopped. And then he stuck his trunk out like this towards where the trough was, smelling. And then he walked right around the pan, came straight to the trough and started drinking from the trough. So he could, from 100 yards away, differentiate the smell of rainwater, pan water, and what was coming out of the borehole at 100 yards, like that. Came straight, made a beeline for the trough and started drinking out of the trough. That just blew my mind. I mean, what does water even smell like? But they can tell the difference between good water, bad water, and indifferent water from 100 yards away. And yeah, I know that you talk a great deal about their powers of perception when it comes to their sense of smell, but that was a lesson that blew my mind. Grant,
Yeah, they're incredible. It's like me telling the difference between a Cabernet and a Shiraz.
well, you are a Huguenot, so if you can't tell the difference, we'd be a bit worried about you. My friend, what an absolute pleasure to see you, and to get your wisdom, get your input, and I'm sure that everybody's going to absolutely love this. And as you pointed out to me, we have much left to discuss, and so I look forward to having you back again soon. It's not like you don't have the time, so you really have no excuse. Grant, Nell, thank you very much.
Well, Russell, thank you very much for having me as your first guest. I have no doubt that this is going to be a success. And yeah, all I can say is go for it. Go for it. I hope you do well.
Thanks, buddy. For all of you watching out there, I hope that you have enjoyed our first podcast. Please feel free to contact me. And if you do have any questions for Grant, email them to me and I'll forward them to him, and we'll get answers back to you until we can get it live for you next time round. Thanks for watching. Stay safe. Goodbye.